Excellent. A very, very warm welcome to this IU webinar series on the Global Convention. It's fantastic to have you here. We have three wonderful speakers assembled, and we will be talking about the Global Convention on the recognition of qualifications concerning higher education. Quite a mouthful, but it is a very, very important piece of multidimensional consideration, and that's why we're here to debate these very aspects today. We have Peter Wells from UNESCO, Chief of Section Higher Education. Then we have Jenneke Lokhoff, President of ENIC NARIC Network, and we have Filip von Ubisch, Higher Executive Officer from the Norwegian Ministry of Education and Research. The Global Convention was hailed as a multilateral milestone, a collective move towards democratizing knowledge, an enabler of a fluid circulation of talent, and global trust in higher education. We're going to kick off with Peter Wells on some of these themes, followed then by Filip and then by Jenneke. They kindly agreed to speak for about 10 minutes or so and give presentations on various aspects of their work and the institutions that they represent. Let me start with Peter Wells, and for Peter Wells, I have a quote that we found in one of our in the archives at the International Association of Universities. My name is Andreas Corcoran. I am the Deputy Secretary General of the IAU. To kick off, you will know that for more than 10 years, UNESCO has taken a lead actively promoting the adoption of regional conventions on the recognition of studies, degrees, and diplomas in higher education. These conventions speak to provide universities with a framework within which it should be possible to raise one of the principal barriers to increased mobility of individuals between universities. Their application is one area in which cooperation with the International Association of Universities is particularly active. An international convention which will bring together the regional agreements within a universally applicable text is currently under study. Currently under study. Now, the interesting part is that these are the minutes from the International Associations of Universities' 8th General Conference in Los Angeles in the year 1985. So my first question goes to you, Peter Wells. What took so long?
Well, thank you for delving into your archives with that one, Andreas, and for putting me on the spot. Just checking everybody can hear me, right? Yeah. Well, that's a very it's an interesting dynamic, and I only have 10 minutes, so I will give a little bit of a quick, brief historical reflection on why that comment was made in 1985, and then look to where we are now. Indeed, in 1985, there were already, by that time, 5 regional conventions, UNESCO regional conventions on the recognition of foreign qualifications for the Africa region, for the Asia Pacific, for the Europe and North America, for Arab states and Latin America and the Caribbean. And at that time, most of the mobility, let's say, of students and researchers and teachers and international cooperation was very, very much localized on a regional basis. Hence, we have in place regional recognition conventions, and I'm very pleased to have Jenneke here who can talk about the Europe and North America context. But in the subsequent years, it was clear that there was more mobility and more will for mobility and more desire for mobility of exchange between students, exchange between researchers, exchange between joint research projects and joint degree programs, double degree programs, which allowed for a more global approach to internationalization and international cooperation between higher education systems, between institutions, and of course, between students, faculty, teachers, and researchers. We tried to do this in 1993. It didn't work. It was not, by member states of UNESCO, was not considered a priority because still, you mentioned 1985, still by 1993, there was still most of the mobility was within regions. So we ended up with what was called a recommendation on recognition of higher education qualifications. Things, times, situations moved on. And I would say that the turning point for revisiting the chance or the appetite for a global convention was sparked in 2011 with the adoption of the revised Regional Convention for the Asia Pacific, the now Tokyo Convention. And that Tokyo Convention allowed for any member state of UNESCO to ratify that convention, which was a turning point. And that had not been the case before. Had not been the case with the Arusha Convention in Africa. Had not been the case for the Mexico Convention for Latin America. And at that point, it was the opening up, if you like, of the world of higher education. And that sparked a decision to propose to member states, look, maybe now is the time to revisit the concept of a global convention which would allow for the recognition of qualifications, not just within regions, but between regions. And that was more getting towards now 10 years ago. Because the reality is this, that we all know that students are mobile globally. We know that research is north, south research is absolutely imperative. We know that the exchange of knowledge circulation, brain circulation is imperative, not only for intercultural understanding, to combine cognitive and emotional intelligence with cultural intelligence, cultural understanding, which builds peace and tolerance around the world. But also now with the Education 2030 agenda, it's essential that all research, all students, all higher education institutions, communities, stakeholders collaborate together. So this generated an impetus for what has now become the Global Convention. It did take 8 years. It was extremely, it was a process which was very inclusive, which was very consultative. And ultimately, we, as you mentioned, Andreas, we were able to get this adopted in 2019 at the General Conference. And the reason I think it was adopted was because all member states and all stakeholders of higher education realize the importance that higher education plays today in the world in terms of not only achieving SDG 4, which is inclusion, equity of access, and access to quality higher education, but also to enable the higher education community to have a real voice within the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal Agenda and Education 2030. You may recall that the Millennium Development Goals, which preceded the SDG agenda, really had no specific role for higher education. That all changed in 2015 with the adoption of the SDGs, where higher education within SDG 4.3 and 4.7 and the targets really spoke to the world and said, education beyond K-12, education beyond statutory secondary, primary and secondary education really has a role to play. So I think there was a combination of factors. Combination of the world is, of course, now global. Research, learning and study programs are universal. At the same time as member states, from UNESCO's point of view, definitely want to engage with the higher education community. And that's where the Global Convention really resonated on many, many levels that possibly were not envisaged in 2011 when we launched this process, which predated the Sustainable Development Goals. I also, I don't really want to have the discussion or the narrative now dominated by COVID-19. But what is evident now in let's say, the last 6 or 7 months is that the ability of higher education institutions, ability of higher education systems to be more flexible, more agile, and to adapt to providing more access, more equity of access, becoming more lifelong learning institutions, which again, I come back to SDG 4.3. That's what it's about. We are standing on the brink now of what I would call a revolution in higher education. It's now been proven possible for higher education systems, and particularly at the institutional level, to be revolutionary in ways that possibly was not considered possible before. And this is why I'm very, very pleased to be able to join this webinar from UNESCO's point of view, with the IAU, International Association of Universities, since a lot of decisions in terms of recognition and quality assurance are at the institutional level globally. Yes, there are networks. Yes, there are centralized agencies who deal with recognition of foreign qualifications, but the vast majority of decisions on providing for recognition and international mobility take place at the institutional level. And so that's why I'm very grateful and honored to be part of this webinar, which speaks to higher education institutions. I just received this week the 2019 handbook from IAU on higher education institutions. And it's there that the real decisions are made. So maybe I can leave it there and pass to my esteemed colleagues. I should say I want to congratulate Norway on being the first country to ratify the new global convention. I don't know who is aware, but we have also received a second ratification from Nicaragua, which just was approved last week by our legal affairs department via the Director General's office. And we have, Jenneke will know this from a meeting 10 days ago, I think, that there is a lot of movement for further ratifications from the Europe and North America region and other regions of the world too. We are hearing very positive signs, and I am guardedly positive that by the end of this biennium, which is our work plan, so that means the end of 2021, that we could have the Global Convention enter into force with 20 ratifications. I'll stop there, but thank you very much, Andreas, for allowing me to take the floor.
Peter, thank you very much for this first contribution, and I'm sure we'll have more time during the course of this conversation to expand on a few of the very, very pertinent points that you've made. For now, let me pass on to Filip. It's wonderful to have you here, and Filip is speaking on behalf of the Norwegian state indeed, being representative of the Ministry of Education. And the reason why we're so happy to invite Filip here today is really to speak about Norway's motivation and its drive to ratify the Global Convention with so much steam. So that motivation and the reasons behind that would be wonderful to hear a little bit more about from your side, possibly also as something to be learned from by other countries who are toiling exactly with that kind of process at the moment. Filip, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for the floor and the opportunity to speak for you and all the people listening. Sorry, just 1 second. My bad. So my name is Filip from Ubisch, and I represent the Norwegian Ministry of Higher Education and Research. And as Andreas said, we will share our view and experience of the Norwegian implementation of the convention. And as Peter Wells just said, Norway was the first state to ratify the convention this spring, and also prior to the adoption last November, Norway has been a long-term supporter and contributor in the preparatory phase towards the adoption last year. So for Norway, global education mobility is a very important topic for us. And to be a bit more specific, for Norway, the convention represents a powerful measure that addresses mobility barriers, which could lead Norway closer to reaching our policy targets, but also global education targets. For instance, the goal under SDG 4 on affordable access to higher education. But let me talk a bit about the barriers and the obstacles that we see. Before the global convention, there has been no global regulation in place to accommodate global mobility. Meanwhile, according to UNESCO, over 5.3 million people are studying internationally, and over 50% of these study across regions, many of these in Norway. Since international students are subject to like a complex web of national and international regulation, it would be fair to assume that these students, they face higher levels of uncertainty compared to their fellow students who perhaps only study at domestic institutions. The international legal instruments up till now have basically had a regional scope for most part. The only exception, or the most prominent exception, is the Lisbon Convention, in which also international students from outside of Europe, as far as I understand, has fallen within its scope. Still, most international students run a larger risk of not getting their recognition for merits collected abroad. And subsequently, this bias is likely to limit global mobility as we see it. At the same time, the need for international cooperation is growing as we see nation states becoming increasingly interdependent. This goes for Norway in particular. We are a small country with around 5.4 million inhabitants. And due to our size, we are heavily dependent on the international society, especially in economic terms. And this has led Norway to become a very internationally oriented nation. And consequently, we are very eager to share knowledge in terms of languages, cultures, and ideas. And that is vital for our continued growth and prosperity. And especially excellence in research and in higher education call for such international collaboration. And therefore, global education mobility is indeed of great importance, not only for Norway, but we would also say for all countries across the globe. And given these conditions, Norway is a strong supporter of international cooperation in higher education. And therefore, Norway has also set ambitious goals for student mobility. For example, the government aims to send at least 50% of the Norwegian student population on exchange outside of Norway. This was, of course, formulated prior to the pandemic that we're now in, but still we have very ambitious goals for this field. Our hope is that this will make it easier for individuals to have their qualifications recognized in another country. These are the words of the Norwegian Minister of Higher Education and Research, Mr. Henrik Asheim. And Norway's strong beliefs in the convention rests on 3 reasons in particular. First of all, the convention was adopted unanimously by all the UNESCO member states, 193, last year. And after 40 years of work, we consider that this represents, as Andreas started with, that this represents a multilateral milestone. And it also sends a powerful message for increased international cooperation within higher education. And this has also, as we see it, put considerable pressure on national administration to follow up on their international obligation. And we believe that this makes it more likely that the convention will succeed in the implementation phase. Secondly, the convention itself provides most international students with increased security and foreseeability. One example, for example, following the Article 5, paragraph 1, each state party shall recognize higher education qualification conferred in another state party, unless substantial differences can be shown, etc. And what does this mean? From now on, the main rule is recognition, while no recognition represents the exception. In addition, this regulation also places the burden of producing evidence on the authority and not on the individual student. In effect, for international students from outside of Europe studying in Norway, for example, they are more likely, as we see it, to get their Norwegian merits recognized when returning home. We believe that this increases the value and quality of Norwegian higher education. And we also do believe that this will contribute, as Andreas mentioned in the beginning, to a more fluid circulation of talent and promote brain circulation, simply because it will become easier to bring your degree with you when moving across regions. Thirdly, the convention also covers students and persons who have been forced to leave their home country. And for Norway, to give refugees and displaced persons the right to have their qualifications assessed, even in cases where documentary evidence is missing, has been important. And we welcome and are supporting UNESCO's initiative to establish a global UNESCO qualification passport for refugees and vulnerable migrants, built on a similar initiative by Council of Europe as European Qualification Passport for Refugees, as this is building on a global effort in contributing to solving the challenges in recognizing refugees' qualifications. To sum up, Norway strongly believes that the convention has the potential to empower students and boost global mobility. However, despite Norway's high hopes, we also see that there are some obstacles ahead that we need to be aware of. Firstly, as Peter mentioned in his speech, the convention doesn't enter into force, even though it was unanimously adopted last year. It also needs at least 20 countries to ratify the convention. And Norway is, of course, very pleased that Nicaragua has joined us as a state party to the convention. And we also hope that this continues for other countries as well. And we believe that higher education institutions can play a vital role in addressing the need for national leaders to follow up. And I would also like to add that for state parties already legally bound to one of the regional conventions, at least for the Lisbon Convention, ratification procedure might proceed rather smoothly, at least based on our experience this spring. Secondly, I would also like to stress that although the convention leaves room for interpretation by the state party, we believe that transnational dialogue is essential. For the sake of our students, recognition decisions should be fair, they should be affordable, timely, transparent, non-discriminatory, following Article 3. And in order to safeguard these basic principles of the convention, it is important to discuss what does this principle entail in practice within the scope of global education mobility, and how do we apply these principles in practice in the best possible way. Thirdly, without global sharing of information, the convention will not be able to perform as intended. In order to properly assess qualification according with these basic principles, states have to provide each other with accessible information on qualifications, institutions, and quality assurance mechanisms. Furthermore, state authorities should also provide assistance for national stakeholders, such as higher education institutions. And I mean, if there are any questions from this on the initiative of the institutions themselves. And in the long term, openness and transparency will hopefully strengthen global trust and further improve the effectiveness of the convention. And finally, but not least, dialogue in the sense of sharing experience and sharing knowledge is essential to ensure good practice. And besides, this would also enable collecting data. And we hope that this could contribute in identifying weaknesses and strengths of the convention, which can be dealt with. So just for me to sum up very briefly, as Norway is entering this new phase of following up the convention, Norway will continue to be a strong supporter and contributor to this work. Nationally, Norway the government will present a white paper on student mobility to the parliament this autumn. And internationally, Norway will seek to take an active role in the international follow-up on the convention. And we hope in more detail to initiate dialogue with UNESCO on how Norway can contribute in the short and long term in the best possible way. And the convention will ensure further quality in higher education research and ultimately the workforce. And Norway encourages, of course, other countries to ratify the convention as we need more cooperation ahead. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Filip. Thank you very much for these first words on Norwegian's stance and their relationship to the Global Convention, and how you also showed the motivation that went into it over the process. I will cut through to Jenneke for now, and then after the next presentation, we'll have the possibility to discuss many of these points together. So without further ado, Jenneke Lokhoff, President of the ENIC NARIC network, very new on the job, and it is fantastic to have you here representing that so important forum of recognition, and all the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas, and also thank you for the invitation, and also good day to everyone that joined this webinar. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel, and it's already been very interesting to hear the views of Peter and Filip. And I'm here today to provide a perspective from the ENIC NARIC networks on the Global Convention. And what I will do in the next 10 minutes is to reflect very briefly on the past of recognition, to provide some context where we're coming from. Then elaborate on the 3 pillars of recognition in the European North American region. Then I will give a brief intermezzo, and then go back to the European North American region and focus on what could be taken as 3 takeaways that may be useful for the rest of our discussions today. And then lastly, go back and reflect a bit on the GRC with some final words on the potential in implementation. So first, where do we come from? Actually, I had a PowerPoint. I don't know if you can pull it up.
It's coming your way. It's coming your way. Yes.
Great. So while the PowerPoint is on its way, I will continue the story. So yeah, where are we coming from?
Just interrupt.
Recognition
can you see it now? Can everyone?
Yes, I can see it. Can we go to the next slide, please?
Yes.
And then probably the next slide after it. Yes, and the next slide, please. And the next slide, yes. Yeah. So yes, so recognition as we know it today has not always been like it is. So in the early decades after the Second World War, when internationalization took off, student mobility was limited, and the attitude towards recognition was to match components of one foreign program with the components of the home program. And this attitude was called equivalence, because the components had to be equal. And there's a beautiful word for this, which is called nostrification. But as you can imagine, this method is rather time consuming. So it became soon outdated when mobility started to slowly take off in the 1980s, and also when education programs further diversified. And then it was replaced with a new attitude, which was called recognition. And a program there under this attitude had no longer to be identical, but it could be recognized if it was comparable in function and status to the home qualification, even though it may differ a bit in detail. And this second attitude of recognition was a step towards the attitude that we are having, that's in common in today, which is called acceptance. And under acceptance, a foreign degree it's accepted that a foreign degree is different, and minor differences can be accepted because of the enrichment the student can bring to the host society and the institution. So differences are accepted as long as these differences are not so substantial that they prevent the student from succeeding in their studies. And we will speak, or I will speak about this concept of substantial differences later on as well. And these different attitudes are also reflected in the regional convention. So the latest generation conventions, which includes the LRC, but also the revised conventions for the Asian region, which was mentioned before from 2011, and from the other regions also include this concept of acceptance. And of course, the Global Convention does too. So next slide, please. So from here, I would like to go to the 3 pillars in the European North American region. The legal pillar, the operational pillar, and the political pillar. Next slide, please. The first is the legal framework that was created with the Lisbon Recognition Convention. And the importance of the LRC is that it brings, that this legal framework really lays down the fair principles of recognition, which is, it's almost stating the obvious here. And the central principle adopted by the LRC is this idea of substantial differences I just mentioned, that introduced the reverse burden of proof, which Filip was just also speaking about. And it's now upon the institution to actually, so a student is admitted unless a substantial differences can be detected. And under this convention, there's also a Lisbon Recognition Committee Bureau that was created to oversee the operations. And another important instrument that was established are the European National Information Centers for Academic Recognition. Next slide, please. Which is the ENIC network, which brings us to the second pillar, which is the operational structure. Now, just going back a bit, there was already collaboration before the ENICs were created under the convention. Before the ENICs, there were the NAICs, the National Education Information Centers, and those were transformed in 1994 into the ENIC, and later as also part of the convention. And apart from the ENICs, there are also the National Academic Recognition and Information Centers in the NARIC network. Those were created in 1984, and those are supported by the European Commission. So in practice, these two networks work very closely together. All NARICs are ENICs, and we have joint meetings. Now, the importance of these networks and of having this operational structure is that they provide a way to, they give hand and feet to the convention. At one hand, there is a dimension towards the national context to implement the LRC, and at the other hand, there is the element where you're working together in sharing information among centers. So the inter-center collaboration is a very strong point, both in terms of sharing information about foreign qualifications. So for example, if one center wants to have information about a qualification, it can just ask, we have a listserv, ask the other centers, and very quickly another center will reply. So this is a very, very strong point, but it's also strong in discussing with each other wider issues of implementation, to discuss methods and techniques, to have peer-to-peer discussions, but also capacity building, streamlining recognition practices, developing approaches, you name it. So it's really a very strong point, this the ENIC NARIC networks. And through the collaboration, recognition is really brought further. Now, then the third pillar, it's political. And now I have to say, that's the next slide, please. This is a political pillar. And well, the first two pillars are actually part of every convention, a legal framework and also an operational structure. This one is a bit particular for mostly, for the European region. And I have to say, not the developments I'm mentioning under this are not all LRC countries are part of this process, of the Bologna process, and also of the European Union. And I'm mentioning here because these both these processes have been really pushing recognition in majority of the ENIC countries, and also there has been a spillover effect. And what I'm talking about is instruments that have been developed for recognition, transparency instruments, such as the diploma supplement, ECTS qualification frameworks, but also the European standards and guidelines for quality assurance. And there is also funding for recognition projects that also benefited beyond the countries that participated in both. So that's why I included it here, because it has really been pushing recognition forward. So that's in a nutshell the three pillars in this region. And I would like to go to a little intermezzo. That's the next slide, please. And I would like to take a snapshot at the present, but also what may be next in recognition. So if I could have the next slide. I would very briefly like to show you what this also means for recognition, these developments. So if I could see the next slide, I can show you how an evaluation looked like in the 1980s. This is a rather long Well, actually, this is a short one. There are examples that are longer of an evaluation statement. And as I understood from my colleagues, there was some rivalry in making these statements in an intellectual style. And yeah, it could take up to 3 days to actually make an evaluation. And this is very different from how it looks today. If I can have the next slide. This is, by the way, an example from the Dutch Center. Here you see that information is much more standardized. We use block text. Part of the information is retrieved from the database. Because information and comparisons are standardized, can be more succinct in the information you're sharing. So without these 3 pillars, we would not be able to do this. And obviously, on the background of the what I just described, these basically 3 decennia, the student mobility has increased, but also digitization in communication has increased. So combined, this there has been this has also influenced recognition. So then another slide as an intermezzo. What's next in recognition? If I could have the next slide, please. Sorry, one back. Yes. So, well, we see now that the legal framework is being strengthened with more regional conventions entering into force and being ratified. With the global convention coming on, we also see that apart from the European North American region, also the Asia Pacific has now established a network from the Asian Pacific National Information Centers. And two other developments is one which was also a bit mentioned by Peter, is the international student mobility streams. And what would be interesting is also to see what we may expect in the future. We see now that a lot of mobility might have or is coming from more east to west, from Asia to Europe, North America, or to Australia. But this might change in the future. There are predictions that this may change and it's going more towards Asia. And this might also have an effect on how we're doing recognition or the focus of recognition in the North American European region. Another one is the changes in the education landscape. So at one hand, flexibilization of education, and when speaking of COVID, you see now that also is getting a push to have education units. And the other development is digitization of student data, which is a global phenomenon. And this might be something that's also maybe not a topic of today, but where the global recognition convention and the dialogue under it could be helpful. So then back to the 3 takeaways. If I could have the next slide, and then immediately the next slide after. So I would like to focus on 3 takeaways from the European region. One is interpretation. And that's the finding actually that a legal text is not an operational text. And recognition in the end is a very practical, something you're doing in practice. So how do you translate legal principles into practice? And we've seen in the Lisbon Recognition Convention countries, this has been a discussion that has taken long a few years. It has taken decades, and yeah, it is something that would be also of interest for the Global Recognition Convention. So, for example, a very clear example again is the substantial difference. What does a substantial difference mean? So, in the European North American area, we developed an interpretation of this. But even though we achieved the network-wide agreement on the interpretation, we still have discussions, also because education field will change. So the interpretation, you will also have other terms under the and concepts in the Global Recognition Convention that maybe have a need for clarification. So the second would be the dialogue. And dialogue and collaboration is at the heart of the ENIC NARIC networks, but for the dialogue and also for supporting collaboration, it is important to understand the diversity of the centers, and the centers are incredibly diverse. Some centers are staffed with 1 or 2 persons, others centers have 80 persons, some centers have legally binding decisions, others give an advice, some don't make evaluation. So the scope and the remit and the task, they are very diverse, and to understand, and you will have this diversity also under the convention, or could have it also under the convention, and there it might be a takeaway that it can be very helpful to create transparency in this diversity, because a good dialogue, this can support a good dialogue and also help collaboration between centers and countries. And then the third one is that legal implementation is not necessarily practical implementation. You see that the Lisbon recognition is included in national law, but the law is not necessarily implemented. I hear another sound coming through.
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. Okay. We'll continue. And then is implementation can be done by different competent authorities. So on national level, sometimes on regional level, and what Peter highlighted also on institutional level. And those levels may not always be aware of the convention text. So this is something to maybe keep in mind. This is something we see in the LRC countries as well. And then lastly, the potential and implementation for the convention. So first, like to go to the potential. Regional conventions technically only apply to the region. But now with over 5 million international degree students, and I just learned Norway has 5.3 million inhabitants, so that's about the size of Norway. It is really time for a global convention, so that each student has the right to have their qualifications assessed interregionally. And the key principle is the principle of substantial difference, and that's a very practical and pragmatic principle to apply. And what's an achievement, I think, in the convention is there's actually a definition of substantial differences in the text. And then also spillover effects. It's not only about the 5 million students that are mobile, but it's also the whole ecosystem that benefits. So each international student brings their experiences and their knowledge to the classroom. So we're not only talking about the convention for only those 5 million or maybe more million students in the future, but also for all those students that are working with those students about education programs and institutions that benefit from mobility. And I think the text very well highlights those benefits. And then regarding implementation, I just would like to say that the operationalization of the convention will be the key to success. Actually, Filip also highlighted a few elements about dialogue and everything. So this is really important, and well, there is a structure foreseen as part or in the Global Recognition Convention, and it will be interesting to see what direction it will take. And maybe also interesting to mention is that NARIC, some ENIC NARICs will start a project in a few weeks that will analyze the Lisbon Recognition Convention against the global recognition convention and to analyze what parts of the convention may be in need for clarifications. Also, the ENIC NARIC networks are working towards further implementation of the global recognition convention, even though it's not entered into force yet, but we're preparing. So that's it from my side for now.
Jenneke, thank you very much for this very, very informative display of knowledge, wealth of information, and I think we really all learned so much about the world of recognition, and especially also the history and the development of the concepts involved. If possible, there are various different streams of questions that are going through my head, and I'll start with Peter. The larger scheme of things, elsewhere we had said it is a multilateral milestone, collective move toward democratizing knowledge, enabler of fluid circulation of talent and global trust. And going through the actual text of the Global Convention, the very first sentence you have, inspired by a common will to strengthen educational, geographical, humanitarian, cultural, scientific, socioeconomic ties between state parties, and to enhance dialogue between regions and the sharing of recognition instruments and practices. There are many, many ideals that are being used, implored, utilized in order to really give a humanitarian background to what is essentially a technical convention. So, Peter, could you maybe expand a little bit about the humanitarian ideals that went into this long struggle to get this fantastic convention off and have it adopted internationally and ratified, hopefully then internationally by at least 20 member states, and then the way is open. Thank you, Peter. If you could just enhance a little bit on
that. Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, in true politician style, I'm going to dodge that question and I'm going to say what I want to say. Good. But I would seriously, I will come back to that, because I think there's a difference here we need to talk between the humanitarian development. But I also, before I speak to your question, Andreas, I would like to come back to what Jenneke was talking about. And I think one of the, in terms of the difference between the regional conventions and the global convention, and as much as the global convention really has addressed the current climate of higher education and the future of higher education, in terms of it's not just about recognition of higher education qualifications as we knew it, the three-cycle structures, the bachelor's degrees, the three-cycle bachelor's, master's, doctorate degrees. It's not just looking to the recognition of higher education provision by traditional institutions or by traditional learning and teaching methodologies. So it's a really forward-looking convention that will say and speak to the realities of today, which are that higher education learning takes place lifelong. It's not just 18 to 25-year-olds coming into higher education and taking one of the three-cycle degrees. It's a lifelong learning process. It's recognizing of different types of providers, whether they be on campus, online, virtual, hybrid, which we have now seen can work. It's about recognition of periods of studies. So not just full degrees, but periods of study, which has been a real problem in the past. That I go and I study in Brazil for a semester, but I come back to Paris and I don't get that period of study recognized. So the global convention, possibly unlike the regional conventions, many of which are 10 or in the case of Lisbon, 23 years out of date, that it's brought us all up to date with what really is happening now in terms of international study experiences. So I just wanted to make that point that we're talking about different types of studies. We're talking baby bachelors, we're talking micro masters, we're talking MOOCs, we're talking all types of study periods within the context of higher education, which have, where they are recognized and are provided by quality providers or quality assured provision, which is also one of the fundamental underliers of the global and regional conventions, is that they are supporting the development of quality assurance processes and procedures at the national level. But we're talking not only about different types of courses and programs, different types of institutions, but different types of learners. It is no longer acceptable that you have to finish high school to enroll in higher education. And that's one of the things that the Global Convention speaks to in terms of lifelong learning access and equity of access to higher education. Coming back to your point, Andreas, in terms of the larger scheme of things and the many ideals and the humanitarian versus the development, well, maybe I've just covered that in terms of what we're saying here is that higher education, access to higher education, be it for traditional learners who I would now consider to be non-traditional learners, because I think that concept has changed and will continue to change. But we're talking about this convention and the regional conventions working in concert with each other, of course. There is no discrepancy between any of them, between the regional conventions and then the global convention, but they are contextualized within the regional spaces where they work. That we are really trying to advance the opportunities for people to learn new skills, competencies, and knowledge that they may not have been able to do before, for their personal development, for the development of their communities, and the development of national and regional economic and personal and professional development spheres. So I think that if we look at this in the bigger picture, the global convention, together with the regional conventions, and I must stress that the regional conventions are just as important as the global. The global is an umbrella which connects the dots between the regionals. They are all there to support development. Jenneke mentioned, Filip mentioned the UNESCO Qualifications passport, which speaks directly to recognition of undocumented qualifications by refugees and vulnerable migrants, which is, of course, very important. But the processes and the methodology used by the EQPR and now the UQP, that is the European Qualifications Passport for Refugees, and the UNESCO Qualification Passport, are the same. They are dignifying and recognizing the talent that individuals have without creating barriers to the fact that I don't have my high school leaving certificate or I don't have my bachelor's degree to prove to you that I can do this. So it's validating the lifelong learning aspects of the development, and I suppose in that respect, the humanitarian aspect. So thank you for allowing me to take the floor again, Andreas.
Peter, just as a follow-up question, because you were speaking, I mean, the Global Convention was adopted unanimously, fantastically. What a milestone! A year ago, nearly a year ago. Of course, you mentioned COVID-19 as a huge factor that has impacted all aspects of higher education and all aspects of political decision making and so forth. My question, however, from UNESCO's point of view, what are the stages now that you're taking in order to push for more states becoming engaged and actually taking that next step that Filip talked to us about?
Sure, very good question, and I apologize, I should have addressed it before. With all conventions, UN treaties, this is the UN Treaty on Higher Education, the first one, we are not in a position to push or insist on member states to ratify. All we can do, and what we are doing, is to reiterate and remind our member states of the importance of this for international cooperation, for peace building, for all of the reasons that Filip mentioned and Jenneke mentioned and I talked about. So it can take time. We're under no illusions that the entry into a force of the convention can happen overnight. Honestly speaking, I think it's quite remarkable that within less than a year, it's now October, within less than a year we have 2 ratifications of this convention. That is quite remarkable. It takes an awful long time at national level. We have been hampered by the COVID-19 situation because, let's also be very honest, ratifying a global convention on recognition of higher education qualifications was not high on the agenda for most countries and most member states and parliaments who have to go through the process in March or since March. So I applaud Norway again for making that happen. We know that there are movements going on, but from our side, from UNESCO, we are working with and we're organizing a series of reminders and we have a strategy to keep the global convention and the regional conventions on the table, on the agenda, because much as education cannot wait, higher education cannot wait. So we want to make sure that these conventions support member states in their drive to achieve Education 2030 agenda, the SDGs. It is absolutely imperative, and the COVID situation has been a blip, but it cannot be the reason for delaying further. So we have a strategy with member states, of course, and all other organizations such as the ENIC NARIC network and our regional convention bureaus and the International Association of Universities and regional associations of universities, all stakeholders. I can tell you that we are now preparing a report. Well, actually, we are cooperating with 4 regional student bodies who are preparing their own report to advocate the ratification of the global convention. And this is coming from the students' perspective. It's their report by them advocating the international community and the member states that they represent to push forward with ratification of the global convention, which is astonishing and extremely vital. This is coming from the students. Ultimately, the global convention is about learners of all ages. So again, we're working from behind the scenes, we're working with delegations, member states, and the different stakeholders, including students and now also employers. And it will be high on the agenda. We have the World Conference on Higher Education, which will take place in Barcelona in October 2021 next year. which will bring together all these stakeholders. It's not about the global convention, but it's all about international cooperation between the stakeholders. So I hope that goes some way to answer your question, Andreas. Thank you.
Very much so. Thank you. No, I mean, I could not ask that question to you, Peter. Let me move towards Filip. Thank you so much again for that. And I think just following up exactly on what Peter was saying, on the global level, of course, now we have the Global Convention, and Norway fantastically pushed forward. And does it work as a model? My question is to you. And of course, you know, every nation state has its own political process. Could you maybe just quickly enlighten what was going on in Norway, maybe also to explain for other countries the implementation process that goes on? And Jenneke, you said exactly the same. A legal text needs to be practiced, needs to be put into principles, made useful, and have pragmatic approaches to it. And that the question there is also, you know, what is the process between the legal, lovely text, well written and adopted by all the member states, and the actual implementation? Over to you, Filip, maybe first.
Thank you. So, for information, Norway has, of course, been part of the Lisbon conventions, and that was adopted over 20 years ago. And as Jenneke talked about in regard to that convention, is that that convention also it doesn't only have a regional scope; it also includes students coming from outside the region to state parties of that convention. So in that sense, for Norway, in a narrow sense, we already had some kind of a structure to deal with international students coming from outside. While not all the regional conventions, as I have understood, accommodate for students coming from another region. So for Norway's part, we did have a national agency for quality enhancement that, you know, that already deals with foreign qualifications, which of course made our ratification procedure quite easy, and, you know, enabled Norway to go forward quite quickly this spring. And so that's important that, you know, for states within the Lisbon Convention, this appears perhaps to be a more smooth process than perhaps for other states bound to other regional conventions, and of course states that has not yet joined any regional conventions at all. So there are a bit of a difference between states, of course, but yeah. And in addition, of course, we shouldn't, you know, of course, Norway is lucky to be, you know, well resourced, and, you know, that we are lucky to have financial measures that are in place. But yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure what else to add than the fact that there are something to learn from being part of the regional conventions. As Peter said, these conventions are also as important as the global, the umbrella, and that you can use the regional convention to get ready for the global convention, if you can say it like that. So I think that's a very important lesson to take on.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. Jenneke, I mean, just to follow up on that question, I mean, you put it right in front of us. You know, it is a legal text that now needs to be implemented. First of all, it actually needs to be ratified within the country, and that is, of course, a legislature procedure. But then the actual concepts and the actual principles to be used. You said within NARIC you are currently debating exactly that. That is one question. Second, where do you see the future of NARIC? It is already such a large network, and it expands Europe. Of course, it is mostly consisting of European nations, but it's also expanded, and you showed this wonderful map as well. Do you see within the global convention that the ENIC NARICs might be in the process of expanding, actually, maybe also going towards other continents and becoming maybe the network under which the global convention might function? Is that a wild idea, or is it rather the future that we have the regional conventions with regional networks, and they will have to cooperate under the auspices of UNESCO?
Can I start with the wild idea of the ENIC NARIC networks and expansion? I think the current structure as it is what Peter also said. The Global Recognition Convention is the umbrella, and you have the ENIC NARIC networks that work. It's large. There are 57 centers, but it works well. And I think for the ENIC NARIC networks, it's interesting. We have been inviting, for example, other regions to our convention meetings. It's interesting, but I am hesitant to say it should be an add-on. I do think, though, that it's very important to have this interregional dialogue happening, and I really think that we can support each other there in information provision and such. I don't think that we're looking to expand the ENIC NARIC networks, and that's not intended, and not within the structures. But this interregional dialogue, it's something that's very very welcome, and we're really looking forward also to expand that further and see where we can further collaborate in information provision or other areas as well. And then going to your first question, how to put a legal text into practice. It's actually, I do realize that in my presentation I just I skipped the part of the whole process of the ratification and such, which of course is a major process in itself, and immediately went into what comes after. But yeah, on this question, I think there are two parts. One is an interpretation part. So how are you going to interpret the legal text? With the different parties, you can all, even with best intention, have different interpretations of the text. And I think you also saw that happening when the text was discussed. So in the preparation of the text, with discussions between countries, you see that there are semantics and there can be different interpretations of what's meant. So it's very important to create the shared understanding of this text and how you're going to implement these principles. So that's where this dialogue again between the parties, it's important. One example of the European North American region, which I'm not saying we should copy it, but just as an example how we a solution we had is, well, first we had a lot of work, working groups and projects on different aspects, and at one point we saw, okay, we see that there's still sometimes different interpretations. We're going to take all this work and put it in one manual, which is the European Area of Recognition Manual, which is a practical translation of the principles of the Lisbon Recognition Convention, based on a work that had been done in the ENIC NARIC network subsidiary text, and it is a further elaboration of the principles, but also with recommendations. And we had the whole network involved to agree on these recommendations. So that's one way that's an exercise you could do. I'm not I haven't had thought it through if that would be something also for the Global Recognition Convention, but these types of the exercises can be useful. And then the other part is the implementation part, and that's something that it's a difficult one. If you look at European American region, you still see that we're we're coming across new findings on where the implementation is, where there are obstacles in the implementation. And one thing we're seeing, and it's still a challenge, and is that whereas on a national level there might be agreement on how to implement the convention, for example, in higher education institutions, even with the best intentions, the Lisbon Recognition Convention is not always known, let alone on how to apply the principles. And that's something that's really an area that's still to be discovered, because who is doing recognition decisions in institutions is also different. Some have admissions offices, but in some cases it's just academics that are doing it as a side job, so to say. So but no, this is really delving into the details, but just to give a glimpse that that's maybe a more complex one. But I do think that that's something that you can see what has happened in the European and North American region, and where the obstacles were, to already have maybe a look like what could we expect with perhaps also in other regions, and try to make a detour, not a detour, I mean a shortcut from those problems.
Yeah, thank you. The reason why the International Association of Universities wanted to put this on the agenda and make it part of our webinar series and have this discussion, of course, is that the IAU, celebrating 70 years this very year, is celebrating 70 years of international cooperation amongst higher education institutions. And of course, the Global Convention is for us really an inspirational move towards better and more cohesive and integrated international collaboration between higher education and, of course, indeed, social mobility, academic mobility for the common good. SDGs, of course, at the International Association of Universities, we have a very important mandate, a very important role to play. We have clusters. We coordinate the clusters of the 17 various the different SDGs in terms of what higher education does in that regard. And there, of course, SDG 4, Peter mentioned it, is for the Global Convention so incredibly important. But there's one large part of our activities also, and that is the WED, the World Higher Education Database. And here I wanted to ask you, because the Global Convention speaks a lot about data provision and data exchange. What is needed in terms of information in order to really technically implement the Global Convention? The World Higher Education Database, just for those who don't know it, it is the WED for 70 years or so in collaboration with UNESCO. Actually, we have been keeping tabs, we've been listing higher education institutions that are accredited around the world, and we also give authoritative information on the higher education systems so far. So I invite anyone who wishes to see and look at the WED to do so at wed.net. My question, back to it, data provision. What are the limits? What is the extent? What is needed? Maybe Peter first, and then Filip, and then Jenneke.
Sure, thank you very much, Andreas. And linking into the WED, which is an extremely valuable tool, of course, around the world, I wanted to link back into Jenneke's last comment in terms of implementation versus ratification. And I put a little comment in the chat here. Even within the Europe region, it's all about implementing the provisions and the obligations of these conventions. The ratification part can take a long time. We know, for example, that Canada only ratified the Lisbon Convention, I think 2017 or 18, but had been involved in putting in place the key core components of what the Lisbon Convention is all about for 20 years. Ratification takes very long time in different contexts. Canada was extremely complex because they have their federal system. But I think some of the core elements that are in the Global Convention and the regional conventions, and they are all linked, are as follows. Putting in place or committing to putting in place structures and systems of quality assurance for higher education, national higher education systems, for providing information on higher education institutions and national systems, which comes back to your WED, the World Higher Education Database. About putting and making criteria, policies and procedures publicly available to anybody who wishes to apply for recognition, and making those criteria and procedures, as Jenneke said, not only available at a centralized body level, but also through all higher education institutions within the system, and sharing that with stakeholders. All of these things are really the key elements of the Global Convention. QA, information sharing, and transparency. These things can be put in place right now as the political process for ratification and going through various committees, and which can be swift in some instances, but could take many, many years in others. So the WED, the World Higher Education Database, is an extremely crucial information point, but as well as emphasizing to our member states, which we need to do, that you don't have to wait for ratification of the Global Convention or your regional convention to start behaving in, or to start implementing processes which are compatible or embedded in the Global Convention and the regional conventions. We've seen this in Europe, and we are seeing it in Africa with the Addis Convention. We are seeing it in Tokyo. We are seeing it now with the new Buenos Aires Convention, which, by the way, we now have the first ratification for the Buenos Aires Convention, which is Grenada. So it doesn't start and end with ratification. It begins now with buy-in from both the higher education systems at the system level, but also from institutions, which is why this is so important to have the International Association of Universities on board and having this debate, because most recognition decisions take place at the institutional level. Thank you, Andreas and colleagues.
Thank you, Peter. Filip, real quick, unfortunately, we're running out of time. If you have anything to add, and then please last, Jenneke.
Thank you, Andreas. No, I would just add that, I mean, that for this convention to be effective and efficient, I mean, it requires that there is a certain amount of global trust in how it works, and for us to build trust, having a transparent and open and accessible information for the people taking part, national information centers between states, within states, local, regional, national level. I think this is very, very important to have good data provision. So I would just stress that this is key in creating a successful convention in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenneke.
Well, I have nothing to add to Peter and to Filip. I fully agree with what has been said. But can I make maybe a last other remark? As I noticed that there are a lot of representatives from higher education institutions and also credential evaluation services and offices. If you have not yet read the text, it's actually something, if you do recognition, to, you get really happy from this text. And especially, for example, page 8 it just lists all the things that is the convention does, and also what recognition can establish. And I'm also highlighting this because recognition is not always seen, also in institutions, as the most exciting or interesting thing. And sometimes officers really need to empower themselves. But really read through the convention and you will find a lot of really inspiring things, and you actually see that recognition is at the heart of internationalization and international education cooperation.
Jenneke, I couldn't have said it better. It is the convention, and it is to be read, and it is a fantastic piece of multi-dimensional, multilateral coming together and agreeing on something so substantially important. And indeed, it really is also an extension of the UN's fantastic work ever since 1948, ever since the Declaration of Human Rights and the insistence of the ability of the right of every person to move and to move back to one's country. And it's a fantastic implementation of that exactly, that one can take one's degree with one. So thank you so much for this very, very enticing, very stimulating talk. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but brilliant to continue. Next time again, and please, for everyone out there, watch this space, the webinar, the IAU webinar on the future of higher education. We have every Tuesday, normally at 14:30, standard European time, exactly at this format. Thank you so much, Jenneke, Lokhoff, Filip, Peter, for participating in this very, very stimulating talk on the Global Convention, and all the viewers out there, all the best. Thank you.